Rachel Davis was a single mother from Newark who worked several jobs just to keep her 6-year-old son Elijah fed and housed, while Lee Ji-min was a billionaire investor who owned a waterfront residence and had spent years searching for someone he could genuinely trust. Then Rachel walked into his home for a personal assistant interview, noticed a loose dining chair nobody else had noticed, pulled a tiny screwdriver from her purse, and fixed it before he could ask her to sit down. That one small decision changed both their lives. But the real question was not why a billionaire would hire a woman without a degree. It was why he would eventually risk losing her, rather than let her believe she had never belonged. It was a raw Wednesday evening in November, in the New Jersey-New York metro area, the kind of cold that came hard off the river and made rain sting against the windows, while people hurried along the sidewalks with their coats pulled tight. High above the Jersey City waterfront, Lee Ji-min stood barefoot beside the glass wall of his private residence, watching ferries, headlights, and office towers glow across the water without really feeling connected to any of it. The apartment was beautiful, in the expensive, carefully designed way that almost made it feel like a showroom, with pale heated floors, simple furniture, soft recessed lighting, imported appliances, and almost no evidence that anyone actually lived there. There were no family photographs, no children's toys, no second pair of shoes by the door, and beside the espresso machine, there was only one coffee cup, because for years, there had only ever been one person to use it. Ji-min was 36 and had built Lee Ventures into a highly successful investment firm. The ownership stakes in his companies and investments had made him a billionaire, while the firm itself managed billions of dollars for clients. Most of its public reputation came from technology investments, although the part of the business he cared about most was quieter. The firm bought neglected apartment buildings and financed renovations that turned them into homes ordinary working families could actually afford, and he rarely discussed that work at business dinners because people were fascinated by the billionaire story and rarely interested in the less glamorous story of a man trying to make broken neighborhoods function again. When Ji-min was 17, Sun-hee collapsed at the shop after months of complaining about headaches. He was the one who found her, called for help, and sat alone in a hospital hallway afterward, wishing there was somebody left who could make the fear smaller. Sun-hee died despite the doctor's efforts. 2 years later, his father died after years of physical work and grief. Ji-min responded to both losses by doing the only thing that made sense to him at the time, working harder, writing software, building companies, and eventually turning himself into the kind of man business magazines described as brilliant and unstoppable. Money gave him control over schedules, buildings, companies, and almost every practical problem he encountered, but it could not bring his parents back, and it could not answer the question that had followed him into adulthood. How could he know whether somebody genuinely cared about him or simply wanted something from him? That was why he was still interviewing personal assistants, after more than 20 candidates had already sat in his private residence. Their resumes were excellent, their schools were prestigious, and their answers were polished. Yet every time he asked the same strange question, if you walked into my home and noticed something broken, and nobody told you to fix it, what would you do? The answer was some version of report it, call maintenance, or make a note for the appropriate department. Ji-min understood those answers, but they told him exactly what he already knew. He was looking for someone who noticed before being instructed, someone who understood that responsibility sometimes begins before anyone gives you permission to take it. Although he had never quite figured out how to explain that expectation to his hiring team. A short distance west of Jersey City, in Newark, Rachel Davis was already awake before dawn. Years of early shifts had trained her body to wake at almost the same time every morning, and at 4:40 she sat up on the thin air mattress in the corner of her small apartment. listening for the sound of her son moving behind the curtain that separated his sleeping area from hers. The mattress had slowly lost its air and leaned toward the floor, but Rachel kept telling herself she would repair it when she had enough time and money, while the real bed belonged to Elijah without debate, because he was 6 years old, and, whatever else she could not give him, she wanted him to sleep comfortably. The apartment was barely large enough for a kitchenette, a sleeping area, a tiny bathroom, and a little space where Elijah kept his school things. The radiator was unreliable, and the walls were thin enough for Rachel to hear the neighbor next door clearing his throat in the morning. She turned on the kitchen tap and frowned when cold water came out again, because the building's hot water had been unreliable for several days, and the landlord had promised that someone would inspect the boiler, which was the kind of promise Rachel had learned to hear without automatically believing. She made coffee, cooked 2 eggs, and prepared cereal for Elijah, knowing that her day would be long because one paycheck could not cover rent, food, transportation, school expenses, and everything else a growing child needed. Rachel worked several jobs to keep them afloat. She cleaned hotel rooms in the mornings near Journal Square, delivered groceries when she could borrow a bicycle in the afternoon, and worked evening shifts at a diner in Jersey City, while the small repairs she did for neighbors sometimes earned her a meal, a favor, or a few hours of childcare instead of cash. She could fix a loose cabinet door, stop a running toilet, release trapped air from a radiator, or replace a worn faucet washer, because her grandfather, the man everybody called Pop, had taught her those things when she was young. Pop had shown her how to shut off water before opening a pipe, how to recognize a tripped breaker without putting herself in danger, how to clear a drain, and how to tighten a loose fitting. He had also taught her to stay calm when something went wrong, because panic rarely made a repair easier. When he died, he left her an old canvas tool bag and a lifetime of practical knowledge that Rachel carried with her even when she could barely afford another pair of shoes. Rachel had found the job listing by accident and sent a short email without attaching a resume because she did not have one that would impress a billionaire. She simply explained that she was dependable, learned quickly, and knew how to keep complicated days from falling apart. So she expected nothing and nearly dropped her phone when an invitation came back, asking her to come to Jimin's home. Elijah watched her read the message again and asked, "Are we going somewhere fancy?" And Rachel smiled before answering, "Maybe," because she did not want to tell her 6-year-old that his mother was terrified. But even saying the word interview made the opportunity feel real enough to hold. Wednesday night, Rachel prepared the best interview outfit she had, a navy blouse and black trousers bought from a church resale table. Because she did not own an iron, she boiled water in a heavy pot, hung the blouse carefully, and pressed the warm base of the pot against the fabric, inch by inch, until the wrinkles gave up enough for her to look presentable. Before going to sleep, she checked Elijah's school bag, set out his breakfast bowl, packed her identification, and slipped Pop's small screwdriver into her purse, because she carried it almost everywhere without thinking. Then she lay down on the air mattress and listened to the radiator click in the darkness, wondering whether this interview might finally be the kind of chance people talked about when they said one opportunity could change a life. Thursday morning, Rachel left Elijah with Ms. Patterson, the retired teacher who lived nearby, and watched him when Rachel worked. And Ms. Patterson looked at Rachel's clothes with a knowing smile before saying, "Big interview?" Rachel nodded and admitted it was a very big one, so Ms. Patterson squeezed her hand and told her not to spend the whole time worrying about whether they liked her, but to let them discover whether she was good at what she did. Rachel laughed softly, hugged Elijah once more, and headed for the PATH train to Jersey City, standing most of the ride because there were no open seats, and she was used to standing when necessary. The building was impossible to miss. A dark glass tower on the Jersey City waterfront with a doorman in a pressed navy uniform, and Rachel took a breath before walking through the doors and saying, "Good morning. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Lee." The doorman's eyes moved briefly from her scuffed flats to her face before he picked up the phone and confirmed her appointment. When he directed her toward the private elevator, Rachel kept her shoulders straight, despite the feeling that everybody in the marble lobby could tell she did not belong there, because Pop had always reminded her that looking poor and being worthless were two completely different things, and she had carried that lesson through too many hard days to forget it now. The private residence was almost silent when the elevator opened, with the Jersey City waterfront skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows under a grey November sky. Ji-min stood near the kitchen, in a black shirt and grey trousers, with a coffee cup in his hand, looking younger than Rachel expected, but far more serious. "Rachel Davis?" he asked, and when she answered yes and started toward the seating area, she noticed a faint, irregular tap coming from the dining area, the kind of tiny sound most people would never register, and then she saw one of the expensive dining chairs shift slightly each time its front leg took weight, as if a mounting screw underneath had loosened. Ji-min noticed her looking toward the dining table and asked whether something was wrong, and Rachel hesitated before saying, "That chair is moving a little. Would you mind if I looked at it?" She crouched beside it and examined the underside, where one small mounting screw had loosened just enough to let the leg shift against the floor. She pulled Pop's little screwdriver from her purse, tightened the screw carefully without forcing it, set the chair back on the floor, pressed down once to test it, and then returned to the sofa as if she had done nothing unusual, saying, "Sorry, I couldn't concentrate with that sound," while Ji-min stood by the table staring at her hands. "You just fixed my chair," he said, and Rachel answered yes, which led him to ask whether she had actually brought a screwdriver to a job interview. She gave him a small, embarrassed smile and said, "I bring it everywhere," a reply that made him smile for the first time that morning. When he sat across from her and asked for something that was not on her resume, Rachel almost laughed because she did not really have a resume, so she explained that most of the jobs she had held cared less about degrees than whether she showed up, finished what she started, and took responsibility when something went wrong. Then she told him about Pop and the lesson that had stayed with her all these years. Fixing something is not just about the object itself, it is about paying attention. Ji-min became quiet when he heard those words, because his mother had believed something very similar, and for a few minutes, the interview stopped feeling like an interview, as Rachel spoke about the man who raised her, and Ji-min spoke about the woman who had raised him. He told Rachel that more than 20 people had interviewed for the position, and that many of them could manage calendars, travel, presentations, and complicated schedules better than she could. But what they could not demonstrate was the instinct to notice a small problem before somebody else had to point it out. When he offered her the position, Rachel surprised him by asking for time to think instead of immediately accepting. On the ride home, Rachel felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. But hope had hurt her before, so she did not trust it easily. She remembered employers who promised more hours and then changed their minds, landlords who promised repairs and disappeared, and Elijah's father, Jerome, who had disappeared before Elijah was born. When she reached home, Elijah ran into her arms and asked whether she had gotten the job, and Rachel hugged him and said, "Maybe," while Miss Patterson studied her face and immediately understood that an offer had been made, then reminded Rachel that she had spent years being the person everyone else depended on, and perhaps this time she could allow herself to depend on a good opportunity. That night, Rachel lay on the air mattress with Pop's tool bag near the door and her phone beside her. After staring at the ceiling long enough to hear the building settle around her, she finally typed a short message to Ji-min. "I'll be there Monday," then sent it before fear could convince her to delete it. Friday morning she gave notice at the jobs she could leave immediately and arranged the remaining shifts around her new start date. She also agreed to finish one Saturday housekeeping shift at the hotel because she could not afford to throw away a final paycheck, and she did not want to pretend that walking away from several sources of income had no consequences. But the new salary would give her a better chance to stop living one emergency away from disaster, and that was worth taking seriously. Monday morning felt different, even though the coffee, cereal, path train, and early hour were exactly the same. Rachel was no longer traveling toward another temporary shift, but toward a job she hoped she could grow into, and Lee Ventures' offices occupied several floors of a glass tower in downtown Jersey City, separate from Jimin's residence. A human resources employee gave her an access card, company phone, laptop, and desk outside Jimin's office, after first explaining the basic systems she would need to use. The first time Rachel opened the laptop, she stared at the screen for almost a minute, because the programs and systems were unfamiliar, and she knew how to repair a sink far better than she knew how to manage the schedule of a billionaire. But she placed her hands on the keyboard anyway, and reminded herself that every skill she knew had once been something she did not know. Grace Lim, Jimin's chief of staff, was organized, experienced, and protective of the company, and she was not impressed that the new assistant had never worked in an office. She told Jimin privately that hiring Rachel was a risk, pointing out that Rachel did not know the systems and did not have a college degree. Jimin listened and answered calmly that the position was not a senior executive role, that Rachel could learn the systems with proper training, and that what he valued most was her judgment, reliability, and willingness to take responsibility. His own mother had never gone to college either, which did not mean she lacked intelligence, and Grace still had doubts but began to understand that Jimin was not expecting Rachel to be perfect on her first day. He was giving her room to become capable. The first week was difficult because Rachel sent one email to the wrong internal group, scheduled 2 meetings too close together, and misunderstood a calendar invitation badly enough to create a small scheduling mess. Jimin never humiliated her or raised his voice. He simply corrected the problem and told her to build a system that would prevent the same mistake from happening again. Every night, Rachel studied beginner lessons on her phone after Elijah went to sleep, practicing the office programs and writing instructions on scrap paper. By the second week, she was making fewer mistakes, and by the third, she was correcting some of them herself, while Grace began to realize that Rachel's greatest strength was not knowing everything immediately, but refusing to remain inexperienced simply because she was new. A few weeks later, the office faced a problem that could have embarrassed the firm in front of a visiting group of investors from Singapore. A scheduled building power test interrupted the conference room's presentation equipment. Shortly before the meeting was due to begin, the building engineer was already dealing with another issue, and the audiovisual contractor could not reach the floor immediately. Rachel did not pretend to be an electrician and did not open a live electrical panel, because Pop had taught her that knowing what not to touch was part of knowing how to fix things. Instead, she noticed an unlocked service closet near the conference room, found the facilities binder, located the approved procedure for restarting the conference room audio-visual equipment, followed the instructions step by step, waited the required interval, and restarted the equipment in the correct sequence until the screens came back one by one. If you're already invested in this story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a heart in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The best is yet to come. The visiting investors never knew how close the presentation had come to opening in silence. Jimin knew what had happened because he had seen Rachel leave the service closet with the facilities binder and later confirmed with the building engineer that she had followed the approved procedure correctly. She had not performed an impossible miracle, and she had not risked her safety to look impressive. She had stayed calm, found the right information, followed the instructions, and solved the problem within the limits of what she actually knew. And that mattered to Ji-min, because it reminded him of Sun-hee, who had always looked for the practical answer before the dramatic one. Over the following months, Ji-min began asking Rachel for opinions that had nothing to do with scheduling, particularly when he was working on an affordable housing redevelopment project in Newark's South Ward. Rachel was careful to tell him that she was not an architect, investor, or engineer, but she did know what it felt like to live in a building where repairs were delayed and tenants were treated as inconveniences. She told him that residents needed reliable heating, simple ways to report repairs, storage that families could actually use, safe common areas, and people on the other side of the management system who would answer when something went wrong. Ji-min listened closely enough to ask his design team to speak with future tenants before the plans were finalized, while Rachel helped organize those conversations without pretending to be something she was not. People at the company noticed the growing trust between them, and the comments started quietly in hallways and break rooms. Why was an assistant sitting in housing meetings? Why was Ji-min asking her opinion? And why did she seem to spend so much time in his office? Rachel heard some of it and said nothing, because she had survived worse than gossip, but it hurt precisely because she had begun to care about the place, and for the first time in years, she had started imagining that she might belong somewhere, instead of constantly preparing herself to leave. 3 weeks later, Ji-min asked Rachel to join a tenant walkthrough at one of Lee Ventures' recently completed apartment buildings elsewhere in Newark, separate from the South Ward redevelopment that was still being planned. It was a practical meeting with the property manager, the maintenance supervisor, and several residents who had agreed to show the team what still was not working. Rachel almost refused because she was still getting used to being taken seriously in rooms where people carried titles she did not have, but Ji-min told her that this was exactly why he wanted her there, not to speak for the residents, but to listen to them. Rachel spent the morning walking through hallways, taking notes about a laundry room that was difficult for parents with small children, a repair request system residents found confusing, and a storage area that looked good on a blueprint but was nearly useless in practice. At the end of the walkthrough, the property manager handed Rachel a revised maintenance budget and asked for her recommendation on several proposed changes, even though she had not been given enough information to verify the costs. Rachel hesitated and said she would not recommend numbers she could not explain, especially when the money came from the same families who depended on the building being affordable. The manager became defensive and asked whether Ji-min had really put an assistant in charge of maintenance decisions. Rachel calmly replied that she was not in charge of the entire project, but she was responsible for saying when something did not make sense. Ji-min heard the exchange from the hallway and backed her without taking over, telling the manager that Rachel was right to ask for documentation before recommending anything. The next morning, Rachel received an internal message saying that several people were questioning why an assistant was being given access to housing meetings and contractor information. Her stomach tightened because she realized the issue was no longer just gossip about her and Ji-min. Her lack of a traditional background was becoming something other people could use to challenge her authority, and if she remained beside Ji-min in the same role, every accomplishment could eventually be explained away as favoritism. She walked into his office and told him that she did not want her career to depend on being the woman he trusted personally. Ji-min listened, and instead of arguing, he told her that she was right to want a position where her work could stand on its own. That night, Rachel lay awake thinking about the office gossip, the way Ji-min had stood beside her without trying to make himself the hero, and eventually, she admitted the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with him. She also knew that love could become complicated when one person was the billionaire employer and the other was the single mother he had hired. So Rachel decided that leaving was the safest way to protect her son, her dignity, and Jimin's reputation before anyone could convince Elijah that his mother's place beside him had been purchased rather than earned. Before sunrise, Rachel left her badge, company phone, and a short note on her desk and walked away, but she did not disappear without a trace because she still had her personal phone, her apartment, and a life in Newark. What she did was refuse further contact for the moment, hoping distance would make the feelings easier to manage. Jimin arrived that morning, found the empty desk, read her note twice, called her personal number and received no answer, and then sat alone for several minutes before realizing that he knew the neighborhood where she lived and the name of the retired teacher who helped with Elijah, but he did not actually know Rachel's exact home address because he had never needed to ask her for it. Instead of sending employees to search for her or using company resources to track her down, Jimin drove himself to Newark and went to the neighborhood Rachel had mentioned several times in ordinary conversation. She had told him that Ms. Patterson lived in the same building and that a small corner store with a green awning sat nearby, so he used that landmark to find the block. He then asked a shopkeeper whether they knew Ms. Patterson, the retired teacher who helped care for a young boy named Elijah, and eventually reached the apartment building, where Ms. Patterson happened to be outside. She recognized him immediately and called him the rich man, and when Jimin admitted that he had made a mistake and wanted only a chance to explain himself, Ms. Patterson did not make it easy for him. She told him where Rachel had picked up a weekend housekeeping shift in Jersey City and warned him that if he truly cared about Rachel, he should go there to listen rather than to drag her back into his life. Jimin waited outside the hotel near Journal Square at the end of Rachel's weekend housekeeping shift, and when she came through the employee entrance carrying her things and saw him standing there in an ordinary coat, she stopped several feet away and immediately told him that she did not need to be rescued. Jimin agreed that she did not, then explained that he had not come to offer charity or ask her to return to the position she had left, but because he loved her and had finally understood that telling someone they belonged was not enough if the structure around them still made them feel dependent, and Rachel listened through tears before telling him that she would never go back to being his personal assistant. Jimin agreed without hesitation and offered her something different, a position in Lee Ventures Facilities Division, reporting to the facilities director, where her practical knowledge of buildings, maintenance, contractors, and tenant problems would actually be valuable. The job came with a real salary, clear responsibilities, and a reporting structure that did not put her directly under him or make her employment depend on their relationship. Rachel accepted the offer on her own terms, and for the first 2 months she kept one Saturday housekeeping shift because she did not want to give up every source of income the moment her circumstances improved. Then she gave the hotel proper final notice once her new salary was reliably covering the bills, while Jimin helped her enroll in a building maintenance certificate program through a Newark workforce training program, so the knowledge Pop had taught her by experience could be strengthened by formal safety standards, building codes, and professional training. Slowly, their relationship changed because there was no longer a direct employer and employee relationship between them. They were two adults learning whether they could actually build something healthy. Jimin visited Rachel's Newark apartment, ate her simple cooking, played with Elijah, and learned that Elijah hated peas and loved pancakes. He could negotiate $1 billion investment without blinking, but he could not assemble a child's toy without reading the instructions twice. Rachel laughed at him, argued with him when he was being unreasonable, and gradually learned that behind the wealth and confidence was a man who was still trying to understand how to be loved without assuming that love had to be earned through control. Grace changed too, because she began to see that Rachel was not trying to become Ji-min or use her relationship with him to climb the company ladder. Rachel was building her own career, and one afternoon, Grace overheard her challenge a contractor who had submitted an inflated repair invoice, calmly explaining that a small replacement part did not justify a $600 charge, and asking for a corrected estimate. Later, Grace admitted that she had judged Rachel too quickly, and Rachel accepted the apology without making Grace feel small for offering it, which was exactly the kind of strength Grace had not understood when she first met her. 6 months after Rachel joined the facilities division, Ji-min invited her back to the Jersey City residence, only the second time she had been there since the interview. The residence looked almost exactly the same, except for one detail that Rachel noticed immediately. There were 2 coffee mugs on the counter. Ji-min opened a drawer and showed her the small brass screw she had tightened on the dining chair during their first meeting, explaining that he had kept it because that was the day someone walked into his home and noticed something he had stopped noticing. Rachel laughed at him for keeping a tiny piece of hardware as a sentimental object, but when she looked around the room, she realized that the residence no longer felt quite as empty as it once had. They sat together on the same sofa, and Ji-min finally told Rachel everything about his mother, including the headaches she had ignored because she could not afford to miss work, the day she collapsed behind the counter, and the fear that had driven him to build a life where he believed money could prevent another loss. Rachel listened before telling him that he kept trying to fix everything because he believed fixing it meant he could keep it. But people were not broken machines, and sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stop trying to control the outcome and simply stay beside someone. Ji-min cried quietly, and Rachel did not tell him to stop or try to solve his grief. She simply moved closer and stayed, which was perhaps the first time in years he had allowed somebody to care for him without immediately trying to repay them. A year later, Rachel completed her building maintenance certification near the top of her class and advanced into a building operations supervisor role within Lee Ventures Facilities Division, finally earning a stable salary with health insurance. Elijah moved with her into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Newark, where he had his own bed and a small desk for homework, while Pop's old tool bag sat on a shelf where the morning light could reach it. The Newark housing redevelopment Rachel had helped shape was completed around the same period, and because future residents had been consulted before important decisions were finalized, the finished buildings included practical features Rachel had insisted mattered: reliable heating, simple repair requests, useful storage, safe common areas, and management staff who actually answered when families needed help. After the opening ceremony, Ji-min asked Rachel to come up to the roof because he wanted to show her something, and when he told her there was a problem with the water tank, Rachel looked at him for 2 seconds and said, "There is no problem with the water tank," because she had already learned his face well enough to recognize a terrible excuse. Ji-min smiled, took a small ring from his pocket, and got down on one knee, telling her that he did not want to give her a new life, because she had already built one with her own hands. He simply wanted to stand beside her while she kept building it, and Rachel looked over the neighborhood she had helped improve, looked back at the man who had finally learned not to rescue her, and said yes. Their wedding was small and deliberate, held in a community garden near Rachel's old apartment, with Ms. Patterson sitting in the front row, Grace beside her as a friend rather than a colleague, and Elijah carrying the flowers with the seriousness of a little boy who had been given an important responsibility. Rachel did not carry an expensive bouquet. She carried Pop's old screwdriver wrapped in a white ribbon. When it was time for their vows, she promised to keep paying attention and repair what needed repairing without trying to control everything around her, while Ji-min promised to stop measuring people by what they could offer him and to keep showing up for the people he loved. When they were pronounced married, Elijah threw the petals into the air and shouted, "Finally!" which made the entire garden laugh through their tears. 6 months after the wedding, Rachel and Ji-min launched Second Start through Lee Ventures, a paid career pathway for adults who had practical ability but had been shut out of skilled work because they lacked traditional credentials, with particular attention to single parents and workers trying to rebuild after unstable employment. Participants were paid from the beginning, worked alongside experienced building crews, received safety and technical training, and earned recognized certificates while learning on real properties, with successful participants guaranteed interviews for permanent positions within the company's facilities network. Rachel designed the program because she understood exactly what it felt like to know how to work, but have no piece of paper that made other people take that ability seriously, while Ji-min provided the funding and removed the corporate obstacles that could have turned her idea into another well-meaning program that never reached the people it was supposed to help. Rachel insisted on one rule from the beginning. It was not charity, because people deserved a paid chance to prove what they could do. One afternoon, a 26-year-old single mother arrived for an interview, wearing a plain sweater and worn shoes, looking like someone who had spent too many nights calculating which bill could safely wait until the next paycheck. When she quietly admitted that she had no degree, little formal experience, and needed something that actually paid, Rachel saw the younger version of herself standing in that doorway. She smiled, invited the woman to sit down, and told her that she did not need to know everything before she started, because Rachel herself had once walked into an expensive residence with a blouse pressed by a cooking pot and a tiny screwdriver in her purse, wondering whether anyone would see value in her. Then Rachel said, "Let's start with what you already know how to do." From the doorway, Ji-min watched the two women begin talking and understood something he had not understood when he was 36 and sitting alone beside the glass wall of his residence. Money could build towers, buy companies, renovate buildings, and remove obstacles that seemed impossible to ordinary people, but money could not manufacture patience, purchase practical wisdom, or make somebody care enough to notice what everyone else had stopped seeing. Rachel had never entered his life to save a wealthy man. She had simply noticed that something needed attention and decided not to walk past it, and over time she had taught him that the most valuable thing a person can repair is not always a building or a broken object, but sometimes the loneliness inside another human being. There were people like Rachel everywhere, working exhausting shifts, raising children, learning practical skills, and carrying abilities the world often failed to recognize because they did not come with impressive titles. Rachel did not change her life because a billionaire decided she was worthy. She changed it because she kept paying attention, kept learning, kept protecting her son, and eventually found a way to open the same door for someone else. Character is not printed on a resume. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is the very person who knows how to make everything work. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Afro K-Drama Cinema for more stories like this. Tell me in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next story.